Our first speaker is John Walton. He's from Wheaton College. We're happy to have John here, and I want you to greet John to the platform.
It's a delight to be here with you this morning and to talk about things that I'm very passionate about, that I enjoy sharing, whether it's in a classroom or a group like this or just one-on-one. So it's a delight to be here. Chris made the statement in his journey of the claim that if the Bible says it, that settles it. And that's a fine conviction to have, but it leaves us with one nagging question. What exactly is it that the Bible says? See, that's the problem, isn't it? We want to understand the Bible, and some of it seems like it's right there on the surface, but there's so many questions about what is it that the Bible is really saying. Lots of the controversy that comes in this area of science and religion, the question of friends or foes, lots of this perception that there's this antagonistic relationship, I think comes about because lots of people are a bit confused about exactly what the Bible does and how it works, what they should expect from it, and how to find that. And in this little time that I have today, I want to try to give you some orientation to that, talk about some issues that might help us think through that, and then also, Chris has said I can talk some about Genesis 1 as giving an example of that. So that's what I want to do with my time today. The handout that you have, that salmon-colored one, doesn't really have an outline of what I'm doing. It just has some support materials for what I'll be presenting. So it's not like I'm following anything there, but you can have that for your resources. One of the first things we have to recognize, and it's really something that, if I were to ask you this, you'd say, well, yeah, the Bible is an ancient text. We know that, but the fact is we rarely treat it like that. As people of faith, we've come to the conclusion that the Bible speaks on and on and on, and therefore we expect it to speak to us, and therefore we think that it's going to speak into our world, because that's the nature of what lots of people believe about the Bible. But that's led to the difficulty that people continue to treat the Bible as if it were a contemporary text. But it's not. It's an ancient text. But what happens in Bible and science is that people continue to try to read the Bible in modern terms. And that's what really frames lots of the different positions on Bible and science or religion and faith and evolution and all of those things, is how you read the Bible in modern terms. And so some people feel that we need to take the science as we know it and kind of just find ways to squeeze that in between the lines of this text and figure out how the text is saying those scientific things which we've come to believe are true. Other people, having despaired of doing that, or feeling like that's somehow too intrusive on the text, see some disparity between the Bible and science as it's done today, and feel like that's not going to work. We have to do a different science. We have to revise science. We have to come up with a science that looks differently, that's going to be kind of driven by the text. So instead of the text being driven by science, it's the text driving science. But you see, both of those approaches are treating the text as if it were meant to accommodate modern thinking. And we try to make the modification as slight as possible sometimes so that we can feel like our worlds are coming together. And that the truth that people want to find in the Bible and the truth that they believe exists in the scientific work can be brought together in this friendly arrangement that's the ideal. But we despair of how to do that. I want to suggest to you that the solution to that is to come back to the idea that the Bible is an ancient text and that we need to start taking it on its terms. People of faith who value the Bible think of the Bible as God's communication to his creatures, to his people, We call it God's revelation of himself. The fact is, God communicated into a context. Now, that's actually redundant. You have to communicate into a context. Communication without the context connection is not communication. When you communicate, you have to have some point of contact with your audience. That includes language, okay? Chris gave us a great example of that when he used some language that was very strange to us in that scientific phrase that he used that we affirmed him on. But at any rate, that didn't communicate to a lot of us, right? Because that is not our way of thinking necessarily. So language itself is part of that communication jump into a context. But it doesn't stop with language. Lots of people treat it as if it does, but it doesn't stop at language. It extends to culture. Communication takes place in a culture, and of course language is part of a culture. But what that means is that as we communicate to one another, we take account of culture. Imagine someone who had no understanding of daylight savings time, came into the United States just as we're ready to change those clocks, 3 weeks early, thank you very much, and wants to understand daylight savings time. Daylight and savings and time, I know those words. Tell me daylight savings time. Well, it's the, where do I begin? Well, we change time. Oh, wait, we can't do it. No. Just think through it. The difficulty of communicating something. But yet, in our normal everyday communication, we just roll out those words and we know everybody's going to understand what we're talking about. That's not just language, that's culture. The Bible is full of the culture of ancient Israel and the culture of the ancient world. And if we're going to understand the communication of the Bible, we have to recognize that God not only communicated to that audience in Hebrew, he connected to them in ancient. It's ancient culture. And we have to try to enter that culture for the Bible's communication to come clearly to us. We cannot just yank it out of that culture and expect that somehow because God did it, that it's going to automatically make that transition for us. As God communicated, he did not do one little bit of updating their way of thinking about science. Not one. There's no scientific advance represented in God's communication of himself to his people. Think for a moment about physiology. Throughout the Bible, the whole idea is that you think, I'm wired. You think down here. You think with your entrails. You think with your liver and your kidney, and more than anything else, you think with your heart. And they believed that. They don't have any other physiology besides that. They didn't know what the tissue was up here inside the skull. They knew it was there. They had bashed heads in war and things. They knew it was there, but they didn't know what it did. There is no word for brain in ancient Hebrew. They believed that all the cognitive processes took place down here. I have a growing capacity for cognitive processes. See, age, wisdom, anyway. Now, when God spoke to them, he did not change their perceptions of physiology. He didn't say, I've got a new word for you, brain, say it with me, you think up here. It wasn't that at all. He rather worked within their framework because he didn't have to change the physiology. Or their perception of physiology. Not their physiology either. But he didn't have to change their perception of it. He rather says, love the Lord your God with all your heart and strength and soul. And our translations say mind, but it's entrails. That's the word, okay? And so that's where that takes place. And God's okay with that. And when we hear that, when we read that in Scripture, we don't have to say, oh boy, now I'm in trouble. I have to go try to figure out how my blood pump thinks. We don't think that. We recognize that this is ancient world. That's how the physiology is. That's also how the cosmic geography is. God didn't tell them it was a spherical globe on which they were living. God didn't tell them about all the different continents. God didn't explain to them how things worked up there in the heavens. They had what the ancient world had, and God worked with it. And he talked to them as he spoke, as he would have spoken to anyone in the ancient world, that there's something solid up there holding up waters. There must be waters up there because they come down occasionally, but there must be something stopping them from coming down because they don't come down all the time unless you're in Seattle. Oh, sorry. Seattle's a good place. Okay? So, and he doesn't have any need to change how they think about cosmic geography, because he's not revealing cosmic geography, and he's not revealing physiology. And he doesn't need to make adjustments to those things to reveal what he is revealing, and that's himself and his role in the world. Again, these are just two examples. There's some more in the salmon handout there, old world science in the Bible. Okay? And that's simply how it worked. God did not change their science. Now, that's more indication of the fact that God is not necessarily putting the seal of approval on their science. He's just saying, that's not what I'm doing. This is an ancient document. He's communicating in terms they understand into their culture and their world. And that's what Chris was talking about when he introduced this concept. So the Bible, we believe, and there's good reason to believe, the Bible is for us as it is for everyone. But it is not to us. It is to Israel, to an ancient culture. And it's not to us. And if we're going to join that circle of communication, we have to get on their wavelength. If we try to make modern science out of ancient cosmic geography, that's just as bad as trying to figure out how we think with our blood pumps. Okay? We have to let the Bible be an ancient document, and don't let that get in the way of the truth that the text does reveal. Now, when we take that to the issues of Bible and science, it perhaps gives us a little bit different matrix for saying, okay, so how do I think about the Bible and science? We want to take the text on its own terms. I mean, that's our commitment. When people talk about interpreting the Bible literally or interpreting the Bible at face value, really what we're trying to get at is the idea we want to take the Bible on its own terms. We don't want to squash things in between the lines. We don't want to make it do what it's not intended to do. We don't want to impose our agendas on it. We want to let it speak, to be what it is, to say what it has to say. Okay, lots of times when we come to the Bible with questions and issues, we almost can't resist this imposing our agenda on it. And that's going to get us in trouble. We have to let the Bible do its own thing. Now, when we think about what the Bible's own thing is, okay, we've already talked about the fact that it's ancient, and we have to have that in mind. I'll come back to that in a moment. But first, we have to talk about the fact that it's theological in nature. Okay, now that's not reductionistic to say, oh, all we get here is some theology and nothing else matters. It's just a way of recognizing what the Bible's main interests are. And when I say theological, I'm not talking about doctrinal. Okay, when I say theological, I'm talking about it in its narrow sense. That is, it is about God. Okay, it's not about people, it's not about history, it's not about science, it's not about poetry, it's not about any of those things. It's not about social issues, it's not about justice, it's not about the age of the earth. It's about God. And the text is going to go right for that purpose and leave lots of the other things to the side. Now, when I think about that in terms of our world, the analogy that I use is that lots of times when we think about science and religion or science in the Bible, or let's even talk about origins, okay? We think in terms of a pie model. The pie model says that here's the origin's pie, and you slice it up, okay, in every aspect of studying origins, and then you try to decide, okay, which pieces are God and which pieces are science. And so if you can describe or define or explain something scientifically, well, then that's not God anymore. We can explain that. There it is. There's a scientific explanation. And so that piece goes to science. Now, of course, you can see immediately the problem of that. The better science gets, the more we develop in science, the smaller God gets. Well, we sometimes refer to it as God of the gaps, and the idea that you've got a diminishing God as you have a growing science enterprise. Okay? But that's the problem with the model. It's not the problem with the issue. Okay? I suggest that we've got the wrong dessert. What we really need is a cake model. Okay? A layer cake model. Okay? And the idea here is that the bottom layer of the layer cake is science and what science can do. We've now got an origins cake. Okay? And what we could call it a birthday cake. Okay, never mind. I'll stop it there. Okay? But the bottom layer represents what science can do. The world and all the investigation that can take place to understand this world that we have. And science is free to roam as widely as possible to the fullest of our ability through that lower layer, because that's the science world layer. The top layer is what God does. The top layer is over the whole thing. For science to spread out through that lower level doesn't take anything away from God at all. In fact, what happens is we believe that everything that science can discover is simply a way of expressing what God is doing, or what God has done, or how God is doing what he does. Science, I would propose, helps us to understand the work of God in our world. And that's why everything that we look at in the bottom layer doesn't really impact the top layer. Science's job is not to penetrate the top layer. We might call that theology or metaphysics or any number of other labels, but that's an area that really isn't science's realm. And they don't necessarily want to go there, and that's not what the discipline is set up to do. But the idea that science can do its job, but that above it all is the work of God. That's the cake model that I present. And I do have a brief description of that. I think it's on the very back of the handout, the pie and cake distinction, and a little bit description of it there. So the idea that science doesn't detract from our understanding of God's role. See, part of this comes into play because we tend to think, and to some extent the cake model can perpetuate it, but we tend to think of this dichotomy of natural world and supernatural world. Okay, and in the pie model it says, well, every time we explain something as natural, that makes it not supernatural. Okay, in the cake model we say, just because something has a natural explanation doesn't mean there's not a supernatural level of operation. But there's still a danger even with that cake model, and that is that we still see a dichotomy. You know, if we make that cake kind of too distinct, too fat a layer of icing between the layers, okay, I'm pushing it. Okay, if we succumb to that, we end up perpetuating this supernatural-natural dichotomy. When we turn to the question of the ancient text, we have to recognize that they had no such dichotomy. They did not think of the world in terms of being natural or supernatural. The entire world was supernatural. There was nothing natural about anything in the world. That doesn't mean that they didn't recognize that there was cause and effect that happened on a human level. Okay, but they never believed that things were happening only on the human level, but rather that everything was penetrated by deity. Sometimes, of course, that created some pagan thinking, but at any rate, that idea that deity kind of penetrated into every aspect of the world. And when it comes to things like history, we find that they're not really interested in what people were doing. They wrote history because they were interested in what God was doing. And if history left God out of the picture, it was worthless. Because the only reason for looking at history and caring about history was to understand what God was doing. And so they have this blended, integrated worldview that sees God as part of everything. And again, that certainly included what we would call the realm of science. Now, if we think for a moment, I know that intelligent design is sort of more in visible position these days, and we think about it a lot. If we move to our pie cake model and just think for a moment about intelligent design, you could see it in either model. If you think of it on the pie model, okay, then what's happening with intelligent design is that the ID people are saying, give me that piece back. That's not your piece. That's my piece. So you think you can explain that, but you can't, because it's more complex. It couldn't have happened the way that you say. As a critique of some of evolutionary theory, ID is trying to take back pieces of the pie. Now, that's one way of thinking about it. Also in the pie model, sometimes the ID approach is to say, well, you may have lots of the pieces, but there are a lot of crumbs left that you can't cover, and I'm getting all the crumbs, okay? Now, ID can also work in terms of the cake model. The question with the cake model, there are some places in Christian belief, there are some places where we would say there is no bottom layer. There's a bottom layer there, but there's some places where the top layer goes right to the plate. For instance, I think one that most of us would agree on, or two, is the incarnation and the resurrection. We don't expect to find natural explanations for the incarnation or the resurrection, so there the top layer is going right to the plate. Intelligent design would say there are lots of little places where the top layer goes right to the plate, okay, where there's no natural explanation, where it must be an intelligent designer. So that's sort of how ID would fit into the two models of pie and cake. Intelligent design has been criticized for being a God of the gaps kind of approach. And if you think in the pie model, of course, that could be so. That could be the case. Okay, but it doesn't have to be. The fact is, what the Bible then is teaching as an ancient document is not just that it has a theological agenda, a theological direction, but it also is characterized by the fact that it is teleological. Okay, now here I have to explain myself so I make sure I communicate to an audience. Teleological simply is, we're in the realm of metaphysics now, and we're talking about the concept that something has a goal, a purpose, an intention. Okay, because in the ancient world they think in that, they don't have this supernatural-natural dichotomy, then they believe that everything in our world is teleological. Because the gods always have purposes. We might not know what they are, we might not understand them, but deity always has purposes, and deity's in charge. There's intentionality, and all of this causation, all of it working from the realm of deity. The Bible shares in that ancient worldview. Of course, there's only one God in the Bible's way of thinking, but likewise the idea that it is thoroughly teleological. Now, that's where things are a lot different from how our modern world often thinks. Okay, the opposite of teleological is dysteleological, with a Y, so it looks like an important word. Dysteleological means that there is no goal, that it's random, that it's arbitrary, that it just sort of happens. And of course, that's part and parcel of scientific approaches, which really feel that it's not their job to figure out how God fits into things, or that it's beyond their ability, or it might even represent their convictions metaphysically, that there's no purpose driving the system. But that's a point on which the Bible would clearly disagree with that perspective, because the Bible is intrinsically, inherently, thoroughly teleological. And our convictions about the Bible would lead us to be likewise. That whatever scientific processes we are understanding, whatever natural processes are taking place, the biblical view is to say that's just how God is doing what he does. And that it's all being done through God's intentionality and with purpose and with goal in mind. Okay? So it takes the random aspect out of an evolutionary model. It does not dismiss an evolutionary model necessarily. It might not. That's up for discussion. But it does not inherently dismiss an evolutionary model. It rather removes the random aspect from the evolutionary model. Now, the fact is then, as we try to understand the ancient text, we have to understand that the Bible is operating from that way of thinking, that teleological way of thinking, that integrated world way of thinking with an old world science context, and that as the Bible was written to them, that's the world of communication we have to enter. My expertise actually is in ancient Near Eastern literature, ancient Near Eastern cultures, and so I bring this to my Bible interpretation all the time, and this is a course I teach regularly at a graduate level at Wheaton. And so we talk about these issues a lot. What we find is that the Old Testament is always operating sort of in the same room, if we can say it that way. They're in the same room as the ancient world. Now, they may be in the same room and fighting like cats and dogs. Sometimes, of course, the Bible is saying, no, those people around you are worshiping idols. They've got many gods. They're thinking this way or that way, and that's wrong. And so there's cat fights going on here in the same room. But it's always in the same room of discourse. Okay? It's not like they're kind of entering a whole different realm of discussion. Even places where the biblical authors are encouraging their audience to depart from the thinking of their world, they're still doing that in juxtaposition to what the ancient world thinks. They don't juxtapose it to what we think. They don't argue against the positions that we might have. They're always arguing against the ancient world. And so they're thinking in those terms. So the text is always in the same room as the ancient world. And we can't ask the text very easily to come into our room. Here's our room, our scientific world, our cause and effect world, our natural-supernatural dichotomy world, our world that's interested in evolution and genetics and whatever it might be. We really can't easily ask the text to come into our room and have this discussion with us. We have to go into their room and have the discussion that they're having. Okay? We have to enter that conversation on their terms if we're going to understand what the Bible says. Remember, that's where we started. What is the Bible saying? We have to enter their world to get that. Now, in that regard, I want to talk about Genesis 1 and talk about how we do that in a text like Genesis 1. The first thing we have to ask is something that most people who have come to the biblical text have never thought to ask, but it changes a lot. It's a basic question. It's a philosophical question. What does it mean to exist? The philosophical term, of course, is ontology. So let's talk about cosmic ontology. What does it mean for the cosmos to exist, for things to exist? Oh, did you hear that? I said things. Because we cannot stay away from our own ontological ideas. We're inclined in our modern world to think of ontology largely in material terms, at least in terms of origins and cosmos. We think in material terms. Something exists because it has material properties. Something exists because I can see it, I can touch it, okay, our senses. And the line between existence and non-existence for us is a material line. Now, it's hard to argue with that. I suppose you could think about, well, what about love? Love exists. Well, let's not, we're talking, a different realm here at this point, okay? But the line, and it's one that we really don't think about. It is inherent in our culture. It's automatic. And we never even say, oh, what's your ontology? Hi, sitting at the bus stop, what's your ontology? What is it today? We don't do that. It's a given. But it doesn't have to be that way. And it's not that way everywhere or in all times. Our culture is a material culture. And our ontology has become a material ontology. And before we go back into the Bible and just plop down our material ontology on an ancient text, we better ask some questions. Is the ontology in the ancient world material? I'm glad you asked. No, it is not. Ontology in the ancient world is functional. The line between existence and non-existence does not have to do with material properties. It has to do with functioning in an ordered system. That's what leads something to exist. Egyptians, for instance, talk about the wilderness, the desert, as non-existent. That would be a very confusing label for us, because we think in material terms. But for Egypt, that was non-existent. The cosmic oceans, non-existent. And what do they mean by that? They don't mean that there's nothing material there. They mean that it's not functioning as part of the ordered world. Now, I hope that you're seeing the connection. If ontology is functional, in other words, if existence is determined by this line of functionality, then it impacts how we think about creation. Because creation is nothing more or less than causing something to exist. So for us, creation is a material act, because that's our ontology. And when we think about creation, we often are thinking about material origins. But if your ontology is not material, but is functional, then creation becomes an issue not of material origins, but of functional origins. If, in the ancient world, their ontology was functional, that would mean that their ideas of creation were functional, and that would mean that a discussion of origins in the ancient world would not have any intention of communicating anything about material origins. Changes how you read a text. Remember, we're asking, what does the Bible say? Do a study on the word create. In the beginning, God created. Hebrew word bara, occurrence 50 times in the Old Testament. You can pull out a concordance yourself. Check the occurrences. Look at the direct objects of that verb. What kinds of things are barad? You'll find that they're very rarely material. They're functional. Purity, darkness, confusion. Jerusalem, the peoples. All kinds of things that are created, but they are not material things. It's not a verb that deals with the material. Even when he baras man and woman, we say, material. Male and female, he made them. Oops, functional. Now, the biblical text carries on that functional idea. We start in verse 2. Okay? Now, the earth was two descriptors, formless and void, Hebrew, tohu vavohu. Okay? Interesting. If this were an account of material origins, we would expect it to start with no material. But it's not. It doesn't. It starts with waters already there, verse 2. But it starts with non-functional. Darkness and waters over everything. Non-functional. And if you check out the use of these words in verse 2, you'll find that that's exactly what they describe. Something non-productive, non-functional. We call it without form. Oops, our material ontology is peeking through. Okay, but you look at the usage of the word, and it has to do with non-functional, non-productive. The text goes on day after day to talk about it was good. And we tend to think of that in what? Ethical terms, moral terms, craftsmanship terms? What are we talking about, good? Well, the text helps us out, because we can find out what good means when it tells us something that's not good. It is not good for man to be alone. Functional. Gotcha. Okay? So we know that even the designation good means, okay, now God is making it functional. The first day. The sermon I preached here a year and a half ago, why didn't God call the light light? Okay? But he calls the light day. And if it's day and night that's being created, since that's what he names, if it's day and night that's being created, that means light here is not referring to anything that physicists deal with. Light is simply a period of light. And that period of light is called into being as God creates time, a function. And day 2, he creates weather. He uses this solid thing up there to hold back the waters above, separated from the waters below. Typical ancient Near Eastern expressions. Typical ancient Near Eastern cosmic geography. God's just using what's familiar to them. But basically, what do these things do? They create weather. That's the function. The third day, the function basically has to do with vegetation. It has to do with fecundity. It has to do with agriculture. And basically, when it comes down to it, it has to do with food. Aren't we glad that on the third day, God created food? So the text is talking about functions, the major functions of our world. I will tell you that that communicates to every culture, in every time period, in every geographical place, a functioning world. Everyone experiences time, weather, and food, and God set it up to work that way. If this is a functional account, then we can't go at it thinking of it in terms of a material account. If it's functional origins, it need not be thought of as material origins. Now, we really get the kicker to tell us what it is. Why are these 7 days? What does that have to do with anything? We get the kicker in day 7, which when we think of the Genesis 1 as a material account of origins, or account of material origins, we don't know what to do with day 7. Because there's nothing material about day 7. Day 6, God creates people. Yes! That's the top. That's a finish. How can you do better than that? And so day 7 becomes an afterthought. You ain't rested. And a throwaway. We don't know what to do with it. It's probably just some theological thing about Sabbath. Okay, we have missed the point entirely. Anyone in the ancient world, get me a Canaanite, get me a Hittite, get me an Egyptian. Anyone in the ancient world knows God's rest in temples. It's transparent. Not to us. We've got to go into their room here and have a discussion with them. God's rest in temples. Temples are made for gods to rest in. That's what it's all about. And the minute the text says God rested, everybody in the ancient world says, temple. They know what it is. We don't. But the fact is, if then we have a temple text, God resting at the end of it, if we have a temple text, then that's saying something important about this cosmos that God is making functional, that he's making it functional as his temple. And we've got a whole different discussion going on here than some kind of material origins discussion. But that this cosmos, this world, is God's temple. And when it says that he rests in the temple, when God rests in their temple, that doesn't mean that they're catching 40, that they're kind of popping their feet up and taking a snooze, watching Sunday afternoon football. It's nothing like that at all. When they rest, that means that, okay, all of the problems are resolved here, and now he can go about doing his job. Because the temple was the control room of the cosmos. And when God enters his temple and takes up his rest there, it is so he can run this place. And that's the point. God has set this functional world up, and he has entered into it and taken his place in the middle of this world that is his temple from where he runs it. Now, that suggests then that we are thinking of the temple, or the cosmos as a temple, that God is resting in it. Now, what does that tell us about the 7 days? Why this 7-day thing? Well, once we get the key that rest equals temple, and temple equals cosmos, so what do we think then about temples and cosmos? Well, temples, of course, had to be built, and then they had to become functional. They had to be dedicated. The process for making a temple functional was to dedicate it. They spend years and years and years mining the stone, mining the gold, quarrying everything, building the furniture, sewing the fabrics, putting the priest stuff together. Everything's getting ready. And after years and years and years and years of the material part of the process, you still have a building, an empty building that is not a temple. It is a building. It's stuff. It's material nonsense. But it's not a temple. But then comes the time of dedication. In the dedication ceremonies in the ancient world, it was to make this collection of stuff into a temple. And how did it work? Well, they usually had a 7-day dedication ceremony. And in that 7-day dedication ceremony, they proclaim the functions of the temple. This is how this temple is going to work. These are the definitive aspects of this temple and how it's going to operate and what it's going to do in our midst. And then they install the functionaries, the priests, the furniture, all with great to-do. Installing the functionaries. If you're keeping track, that's days 4 through 6. Okay? And then, as the grand finale, the climax on the final day, the 7th day, deity is brought in and takes up his residence, his rest in the temple, at which point now it becomes a functional temple with God in its midst and his people, the priests, serving his purposes. As a functional account, Genesis 1 is a temple account of this temple cosmos. Now, if it's true that these 7 days are connected to a temple dedication, as it were, of the cosmic temple, that they are 7 days of functions, then those 7 days, whether they're 24 hours, I've got no problem with that, by the way, whether they're 24-hour days or something else, but those 7 days have nothing to do with material origins. They have nothing to do with the age of the material earth. The material is outside this process. And if Genesis 1 is a functional account in temple terms, then Genesis 1 and its 7 days tell us nothing about the age of the earth, and we're left to explore that and draw what conclusions we can from our information. I close with this. In the ancient world, from an Israelite perspective, Nebuchadnezzar and Cyrus were kings of the world, each with their own gods and their own agendas. But people of faith, the prophets particularly, saw them as God's instruments nonetheless. Whatever Nebuchadnezzar and Cyrus thought they were doing, the prophets had this perspective that God is over all, and God is sovereignly using these mighty kings who have their own agendas and their own gods, and he's using them for his purposes. Today, science is king of the world, and science has its own gods and its own agendas, but no less is an instrument of God. As scientists probe and penetrate and understand and explain the world around us, people of faith can appreciate that science reveals the work of God rather than disproving it. And it doesn't matter whether scientists are on board with that perspective or not, as it didn't matter with Nebuchadnezzar or Cyrus. But the work they are doing is God's work. And as people of faith, we can appreciate it as helping us to understand the breadth and depth and glory of God's work. And it doesn't serve as a foe at all, but an instrument of God. Thank you.